tonight. So it is my privilege to introduce Mark Lowery, our guest speaker. He is the Assistant Director, Office of Climate Change for the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. He will describe anticipated effects of climate change on New York's communities, residents, businesses, and natural resources, and necessary solutions. His presentation will include a summary of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act requirements and an update on implementation of this law. He'll describe the critical role local governments must play in meeting the state's emission reduction requirements and state support for local action through the Climate Smart Communities program. Thank you so much, Mark, for joining us, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Cindy. Is the sound okay? I'm assuming the sound is okay?
It's good, Mark, yes.
Okay, all right, let me know if I fade for whatever reason. I just want to say how deeply honored I am to have been invited to speak to you this evening at an event named for one of our great environmental heroes. And I thought it'd be appropriate to spend just a moment reflecting on what we think Rachel Carson might say if she were living and working today. Rachel did write about warming ocean waters and rising seas as early as 1951. And she actually wrote in 1953 that the Earth was, quote, moving into a warming cycle of unknown duration. However, Ralph Keeling's work to begin documenting the rise in carbon dioxide that would lead to the global warming that we have been experiencing over the last few decades was still several years away. And it appears that Carson's descriptions of warming and rising waters were actually based on her personal observations, and at best were simply reflective of climate change that had yet to be described in the scientific literature. And it's unclear whether her 1953 prediction of a coming warming cycle was based on her understanding of the current science of the effects of oceanic currents on atmospheric and ocean temperatures, or some prescient understanding of the likely effects of rising CO2, which had been predicted. In any case, we can continue to draw a valuable lesson on our need to continually monitor and observe the environment on which we all depend and in which we live. And I think that we can fairly easily guess what Rachel Carson might say in 2020 by simply inserting the words climate polluters for insect controllers in this quote from her book, Silent Spring. According to independent analyses by NASA and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, Earth's global surface temperatures in 2019 were the second warmest since modern record keeping began in 1880. And 2020 may be on track to even break that record. Globally, 2019 temperatures were second only to those of 2016 and continued the planet's long-term warming trend. The past 5 years have been the warmest of the last 140 years. There were several very important reports that actually came out in the fall, specifically November of 2018. And it's worth going back, even though November 2018 seems like lifetimes ago, to look at what those reports said. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, issued a report that indicated that 1.5 degrees centigrade warming could trigger feedback loops with the potential to cause runaway warming. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, first of all, understand that we have already warmed the Earth by 1 to 1.1 degrees centigrade. So we're more than 2/3 of the way toward that threshold of 1.5 degrees centigrade. And when we talk about feedback loops, we talk about the warming precipitating changes that continue to exacerbate the warming. One common example is methane being released from defrosting permafrost. And methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. And so the more the Earth warms, the more the permafrost defrosts, and leading to more methane release. And there are many other similar examples, many of which do involve, in fact, methane. Release from deep ocean waters is another example. This report found that 1.5 degrees centigrade posed many risks to human civilization because of the hazards it posed to the environment on which we depend and on our economic and agricultural and ecological systems. Allowing temperatures to rise 2 degrees centigrade, which had long been thought to be sort of the threshold that we could adapt to, would pose even greater risk. And the important thing to remember, even though back in 2015, there was a lot of celebration of the Paris Climate Accord, that even if every nation that signed the Paris Climate Agreement kept every one of its promises, and we all know of a nation that has decided that it's not going to abide by the promise that it made by its signature under the Obama administration on to the Paris Climate Agreement, that even if every one of those promises is kept, we will still see about a 3.2 degrees centigrade rise by 2100. So the Paris Climate Agreement does not keep warming at 2 degrees centigrade warming, let alone 1.5 degrees. And in fact, this IPCC 2018 report estimated that we, and by that I mean global society, is on a track. Its business as usual emissions track will emit enough greenhouse gases by 2030, in just 10 more years, to make holding warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade impossible. That we will have already by 2030 emitted enough greenhouse gases that even if we were to stop emitting greenhouse gases in 2030 completely, the Earth would continue to warm to the point where we could not keep our goal, the stated goal of the Climate Paris Agreement, of keeping warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And the other thing that this another UN report called the GAP report indicated, that we and our children and my grandchildren, and I suspect many of you have grandchildren, will pay the price, because our procrastination means that we will have to implement even more draconian, even more drastic measures to hold warming to anything like the levels that we would need to maintain a livable planet. And I do admit that the introduction says I'm going to talk about the effects of climate change, but I'm actually not going to do that very much. I think that I'd rather spend my time today talking about solutions, both at the state level and potential solutions at the local level, because I suspect that most of you on this call are already pretty well versed on the likely effects of climate change. So I'll just hit a few highlights. Much of New York State's focus has been on the adaptation to flooding, both sourced from sea level rise. As waters warm, they rise, and we know that we have already seen about 13 inches of sea level rise on along New York's ocean coast in the last century or so. That sea level rise exacerbates coastal storms. We've also seen more increased frequency and severity of riverine flooding, which is associated with more extreme precipitation. We're also concerned about the effects of rising temperature on aquatic ecosystems and important agricultural crops, including dairy, apples, and maple syrup, all of which are iconic and economically important crops here in New York State. We expect, even though a warming atmosphere holds more water, and that New York State will receive actually more water in total, at the same time, we're expecting to see more frequent short-term droughts that are punctuated by heavy precipitation that will affect agriculture and wetlands, and of course, extreme heat threatens both public health and infrastructure. Some secondary effects that we've already seen have included ocean acidification and associated collapse of the Long Island Sound lobster fishery, and diseases and pests that have already hit New Yorkers hard and will likely continue to do so. So in response to the threats posed by climate change, and I will say in somewhat in response to much of the public concern that was brought forth by people like you, advocates like those who are on this call. The New York State Legislature passed in June of 2019, and the governor signed in July of 2019, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And this law became effective on January 1st of 2020. The Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act establishes very aggressive, often called nation-leading or even world-leading greenhouse gas emission reduction goals, and sets them in statute in the law for the first time in New York State. In fact, we shouldn't even be calling them goals. These emission requirements are, they are what I just said, they are requirements. For the entire economy. They do not apply just to New York State operations, me driving a state car, but to every activity that takes place within New York State. The law creates very strong renewable and clean energy goals and codifies and strengthens clean energy targets that New York State already had in place, and essentially puts New York State on a path to carbon neutrality by the middle of this century. And as I'll describe, the law includes strong commitments to disadvantaged communities, environmental justice, and ensuring a just transition to a low carbon economy. One of the first steps that the law required was for DEC to adopt a regulation that sets those 2030 and 2050 greenhouse gas emission limits. I guess I didn't actually say it. What the law requires is that the state reduce its greenhouse gas emissions to no more than 60% of their 1990 levels by 2030, and reduce them to no more than 15% of their 1990 levels by 2050. That is a 60% and a 40% by 40% reduction by 2030 and an 85% reduction by 2050. When I say that the law puts us on a path to a carbon neutral economy, we are further, the plan that has to be developed is to include recommendations for sequestering the equivalent of the remaining 15% through active sequestration of carbon and better soil management, agriculture and forest soil management, and better management of what we call blue carbon, carbon that is sequestered in fresh and tidal wetlands. So DEC actually has to write, was required to go back to 1990, calculate using some new accounting rules what our greenhouse gas emissions were back in 1990, and our estimate is that they were a little bit over 400 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and then do the arithmetic, if you will, to calculate what would be equal to the equivalent of 60% and 15% for 20 and 30 and for 2030 and 2050 respectively. So you see there, those are the emission limits, greenhouse gas emission limits for the state of New York under this law by 2030 and by 2050. And you can see that we have to essentially reduce our emissions by about 360 million metric tons by 2050. Now, the good news is that we've already actually started that decrease. So we're not starting at 401 million metric tons today. Our emissions today are actually somewhat lower, but not low enough. And we still have a lot of work to do, even to meet the interim goal of a 40% reduction by 2030. And just even though the planning is still
Mark, somehow you muted yourself.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. I'm not sure if that was an errant mouse click or what. I'll start. We know that we will need deep market penetration of electric vehicles and use of electricity for space and water heating. We would know that we need to reduce our waste in general, and especially deposition of organic material into landfills where it forms methane, again, that very powerful greenhouse gas that escapes. And we need to eliminate the use of high global warming refrigerants and vastly improve energy efficiency and conservation in all sectors. So in support of the larger emission reduction requirements, the climate law amends the public service law to require that the Public Service Commission establish a program that in turn requires that 70% of all electricity that's sold in New York State, whether it is generated within the state or outside the state, that electricity must be produced by renewable sources by 2030. So you'll hear this reference to a 70 by 30 renewable energy standard. And by 2040, all electricity sold in New York State must be derived from clean energy sources. So you'll hear, again, this reference to a Clean Energy Standard 2.0. Again, that this requirement that by 2021, by 2040, all of our electricity will be sourced from clean energy sources, which is essentially wind, water, solar, and nuclear for clean energy. The definition of renewable does not include nuclear. Further, the Public Service Commission is required to establish programs to procure 9 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035, 6 gigawatts of community solar by 2025. Now here we're not talking about residential rooftop solar, but actually larger installations that are referred to as community solar, and 3 gigawatts of energy storage by 2030. And by energy storage, that mostly means batteries. It could mean something like pump storage, but the idea of having a significant amount of storage on the system is to help balance the inherent intermittency of wind and solar. The important thing to note is that these targets are not being put in place to address our current needs, but to address the future needs of what will be an all-electric economy, because these reflect the overall strategy of electrifying our entire economy while at the same time reducing the emissions associated with electric power generation. And we are making progress. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, the Public Service Commission took the important step of adopting an order, which is the process that the Commission uses to adopt the order to implement the 70 by 30 clean energy standard and begin the necessary proceedings for procuring that 9 gigawatts of offshore wind. Although the Department of Public Service and the Public Service Commission have important roles to play in reducing emissions associated with power generation, the regulatory responsibility for meeting the emission limits rests largely with DEC. In a little over 3 years, DEC is required to adopt regulations to ensure compliance with those emission reduction requirements that I pointed to, and under the CLCPA would have authority to regulate virtually all aspects of the economy except livestock management. We're not allowed to, under the law, DEC doesn't have authority to regulate emissions from cows or other livestock, but that doesn't mean that those emissions are untouchable in terms of providing incentives and other means by which we can drive emission reductions from livestock as well. The Climate Action Council, which I'll describe in a moment, is responsible for developing what's called a scoping plan. I personally think that's an unfortunate term. We're really not scoping here in the same sense that scoping is used in the State Environmental Quality Review Act. This is real. When you hear someone talk about a scoping plan in this context, think of it as an action plan. So the council is responsible for developing a scoping or an action plan that will consist of the recommendations for how to achieve economy-wide greenhouse gas reductions. And DEC will in turn base its regulations on the recommendations that are included in that plan. In developing these regulations, DEC is required by the Act to maximize benefits such as job creation and reduction of local air pollution, and to do that especially in disadvantaged communities and to minimize leakage. And I have to stop and pause to describe what I mean by leakage. We're not talking about CO2 or methane coming out or anything else coming out of a pipe when we talk about leakage in this context. We're talking about economic activity that moves from a jurisdiction that has decided to regulate it to a jurisdiction that is not regulating it. And the example I often use is the cement plant that sits south of Albany. If that plant decides, okay, we don't want to be regulated by the state of New York, we're going to move to Albany, Georgia, which isn't going to regulate us. That does not help New York State. We lose the economic activity, and that industry continues to emit greenhouse gases, which have the same global atmospheric effect, whether they're emitted in Georgia or New York State. So the idea of reducing leakage is to help those businesses and industries that we want to keep in New York to clean up as much as possible, and even to attract industries, additional clean industries to New York State, but not to drive activity out of the state. As I said, the law establishes a Climate Action Council, which is responsible for developing the scoping plan that will in turn inform DEC's regulations. This council comprises 22 members, the heads of 12 state agencies and authorities, 2 additional gubernatorial appointments, and 8 legislative appointments. It's co-chaired by the president of the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority and the commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation. All these appointments have been made, and in fact, the council has started its work and has already met 3 times. The law further requires the council to appoint at least six advisory panels. Each panel, and you'll see them listed on the sidebar, represents an important source of greenhouse gas emissions in New York State. Appointees to these panels are experts in the respective fields represented by the panel, and they are drawn from government, industry, academia, and various advocacy groups. They are not, for the most part, with a few exceptions, made up of state agency staff. These are mostly outside folks who are being convened in these advisory panels because of their expertise, and their responsibility is to make recommendations and to comment on recommendations that come to be considered by the Climate Action Council for inclusion in the scoping plan. Each panel is chaired by the head of the most relevant agency. So for instance, the Transportation Advisory Panel is chaired by, as you might expect, the commissioner of the New York State Department of Transportation. And each panel is supported by a staff working group that is drawn from various state agencies. The law also creates 2 other working groups, the Just Transition Working Group and the Climate Justice Working Group. The Just Transition Working Group is primarily responsible for making recommendations to the Climate Action Council to ensure that workers and communities that depend on the fossil fuel industry, whether it's for jobs or tax-based property tax, what have you, that those communities and workers do not suffer unduly from the transition to a clean energy economy. The Just Transition Work Group is also responsible for advising on reuse of sites that are currently used as fossil fuel power plants, and for providing recommendations to maintain New York State's economic competitiveness and to reduce that leakage that I talked about. The law requires that at least 35% of the benefits that accrue from renewable energy and energy efficiency programs in New York State go to disadvantaged communities. The law does not define exactly what a disadvantaged community is, but the Climate Justice Working Group is responsible for using a very public process to develop the criteria by which these disadvantaged communities will be defined, and that work is also underway. So just to give an idea of how fast-paced this whole process is, I know sometimes we talk about, this is taking us 4 years to do, and that's true, but then you should think, if you've ever dealt with a state agency like DEC, and think about how long it takes us to develop a recommendation. That's actually a very fast schedule. DEC had, as I've already described, just 1 year to adopt a regulation setting the 2030 and 2050 greenhouse gas emissions limits. We are on track to do that, but it has not been easy. By 2022 and annually thereafter, DEC is required to release a greenhouse gas report that will include an inventory of the state's greenhouse gas emissions for that year. So we will be able to monitor what kind of progress we are making toward achieving these emission reduction requirements. And the report is to include an analysis of the trends in emissions of each emission sector. The council is required to complete the draft scoping plan by the end of next year. So a little bit less than a year and a half, the council is required to make public its draft scoping plan. And then through 2022, the council was required to conduct an extensive public comment process, including several public hearings to be held around the state and an open public comment period, and then to take that public input, incorporate it into the final plan by 2023. DEC has then just 1 more year after the publication of that final plan to promulgate the regulations that will be necessary to ensure achievement of those emission reduction requirements. So again, very fast-paced. I happen to have been appointed to the Land Use and Local Government Advisory Panel, and I can tell you from my personal experience that the members of the panels and the staff support working groups have hit the ground running, despite the challenges that have been posed by the pandemic. We can probably easily blame the pandemic on at least a 6-month delay before we actually were able to earnestly begin work. But the pandemic did not change the statutory deadlines. And so we have been directed by our superiors to do everything possible to meet the deadlines actually set in the law. As you can see in this graph, we are in the midst, the advisory panels and the associated staff working groups are in the midst of developing recommendations, actually scoping out to determine what kind of activities we will turn our attention to, and looking for sources and information, case studies that we can draw on and so forth, to actually begin fleshing out the recommendations to be included. I'll mention here that most of the panel meetings and all of the Climate Action Council meetings are open to the public. They're all being conducted just like this, virtually, but these meetings, they are open to the public to listen, not to participate, but to listen. The recordings of previous council meetings and the associated materials are available, and notices of the upcoming events are published at climate.ny.gov, and I will put this up a little later, climate.ny.gov. And you can also sign up to join the Climate Act's mailing list, email list, so you can get notification of opportunities to not only watch the proceedings of the council meetings and most of the panel meetings, but also look for your opportunities to provide public input, because each advisory panel will be holding at least 1 or 2 public sessions where the members of the public can provide input. I won't take the time to go through this in detail, and certainly I'm not going to do it for all 6. Actually, there are going to be 7 advisory panels. But I just want to give you an idea of the scope, the way we're thinking about what these advisory panels will do. And so the one that I'm on, the Land Use and Local Government Advisory Panel, is mostly going to be focused on how do we reduce vehicle miles traveled by applying smart growth principles. We know in New York State that transportation emissions are our largest single sector. Something like 35 or 36% of our emissions come from our cars and planes and buses. We tend to think about emissions from power plants, but power generation is responsible only for about 14% of our total emissions. So we need to not only electrify our fleet, but reduce the number of miles that we travel. And part of the way we do that is through better land use planning. So that will be a focus of this panel. We want to reduce the barriers to public and private adoption of solar and wind power. Local governments they're responsible for about 2 to 3% of total greenhouse gas emissions, but they set examples and they can save taxpayer money as they reduce their emissions. So we'll be developing recommendations related to that. And then one of the things we will be looking to do is to see how local governments can play a role in implementing strategies that are developed in other advisory panels. So there are going to be larger strategies that come out of, say, the power generation panel that will have a role for local governments to play. So we'll be looking at that. And finally, most people who have talked about the CLCPA have focused on the mitigation, the emission reduction requirements, and that's appropriate. But the law also says that we are to make recommendations related to adaptation and resilience to the effects of climate change. And the responsibility for doing that has been placed with this panel. So there will be adaptation and resilience aspects to our recommendations as well. Now I want to move on a little bit. Before the CLCPA was passed in 2019, the governor signed in 2014 another law known as the Community Risk and Resiliency Act. We call this CARA. The CARA originally required that applicants to a fairly small group of state funding programs and for several types of DEC permits showed that they had considered the effects of sea level rise, storm surge, and flooding in their project design. The law didn't give DEC any real authority to require a mitigation of those hazards. It just said that the applicant had to show they had considered it. After several years of analysis and work, I will give you a little bit of a preview that we will release 4 documents in the next 4 weeks that will provide guidance on how DEC programs and other agencies should evaluate project siting and design to reduce flood risk, and how project designers can use natural resources and nature-based features to reduce risk. So we'll be, at that point, implementing what the precepts, if you will, the requirements of the original 2014 Community Risk and Resiliency Act. However, the CLCPA in 2019 amended the Community Risk and Resiliency Act and greatly expanded the scope of the CRRA to include applicants for major permits in almost all DEC permit programs and to include all climate change effects, not just sea level rise and flooding, as was the case of the original law. So to comply with this amended law, DEC has begun a process of reviewing all of its permit programs to determine where consideration of climate change is relevant in the decision-making process, and the necessary permit and regulatory updates it will have to make, and the information needs that we will for both applicants and review staff. So that's a work in process that will likely keep staff busy for the next several years. So we will have gone from thinking about just sea level rise and flooding to essentially having responsibility for requiring that in almost all of our permit programs that the applicants demonstrate that they've considered climate change writ large, if you will. And I'll also say that the amended CARA gives DEC explicit authority for the first time to actually require mitigation of those hazards. So I want to shift gears a little bit. Remember, I just talked about the local land use and local government advisory panel, and that advisory panel.
And they can't, yeah.
They can't judge the audience.
Yeah.
That advisory panel was formed because of the recognition that local governments are important in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and adapting to the effects of sea level rise. And we actually recognized that way back shortly after the Office of Climate Change was formed in 2007. So we launched the program called the Climate Smart Communities Program in 2009. This is a free and voluntary program that is now a joint effort of 7 New York State agencies. And many people think of it as a DEC program, but actually it's supported by NYSERDA, the New York Power Authority, and the Departments of State, Public Service, Transportation, and Health. We have structured the Climate Smart Community Program to provide the things that local governments tell us they need most: information, technical assistance, and funding. And we throw in some leadership recognition for good measure, primarily through the Climate Smart Community Certification Program. Increasingly, we provide our guidance through the Climate Smart Community Certification Portal, which is an online tool that I'll show you a few pictures of in a moment. The content available at the Climate Smart Community Portal is primarily intended to guide climate smart communities as they pursue certification, which I will explain momentarily, but it is available and we think useful to all communities, whether or not they are interested in pursuing climate smart community certification. Further, NYSERDA provides free technical assistance to municipalities through its Clean Energy Community Coordinators. And though the coordinators' focus is support for NYSERDA's Clean Energy Community Program, they are also familiar with the Climate Smart Community Program and can provide assistance with many aspects of the Climate Smart Community Program. In fact, obtaining Climate Smart Community certification is one of the high impact actions communities can take to achieve NYSERDA designation as a clean energy community. And I want to stop right here and say, we know that this is confusing. We're talking about climate smart communities and clean energy communities, and even our staff mix them up. The branding may be unfortunate, but we do see these programs as complementary. Many municipalities that have not been involved in either have found it useful to start with the more energy-focused community energy, there we go, clean energy community program, and then building on their success in that program, launch into the more comprehensive climate smart community program. Sounds like someone has a radio on.
Yeah, we just have a number 105750. Can you please mute your microphone? Thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, our grants program is currently on hold because of the state budget concerns, but we have been able to provide grant support for local action to adapt to climate change and reduce greenhouse gas emissions for the past 4 years, and to offer rebates for municipal purchase or lease of clean vehicles and grants for installation of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And I know that Schenectady has taken advantage of some of those opportunities. Now, you've heard me talk about certified climate smart communities, but we actually recognize 2 basic climate smart community designations: registered and certified. Communities get started and receive designation as registered climate smart communities when their local legislative bodies pass a resolution adopting the 10-point climate smart community pledge. And I want to emphasize that the pledge is voluntary and includes nothing that's enforceable. In 2014, to recognize those communities that have put their pledge into action, and also to provide a more structured framework for local action, we added certification to the Climate Smart Community Program. To achieve certification, climate smart communities must document completion of a set of mandatory and priority actions, and they must earn enough points by completing actions they choose from a long list of other possible actions that include planning, adoption of specific policies, project implementation, and measurement of actual results. The requirements for each action are described at the Climate Smart Community Portal I mentioned earlier, and the portal also provides guidance on completion of the action, links to relevant information, technical resources, etc. The wide variety of community types and sizes that have achieved certification indicates to us that we have met our goal of providing a program that can motivate local climate action that has both sufficient rigor to achieve real results and sufficient flexibility that virtually any community in New York State can successfully participate. And in fact, participation has grown substantially since the basic program was launched in 2009. And we have seen a surprising level of interest in the certification program. We are now up to 62 certified climate smart communities. And it's of interest to note that we especially saw an increase in the pace, in the amount of interest in the certification program shortly after President Trump announced that the U.S. would withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement, which he announced in 2017. I'll also note that the 8.8 million New Yorkers who live in climate smart communities, that does not include New York City. New York City does not participate in the program. We'd like to see the city come in, but it hasn't so far. But if you consider the active climate program that New York City does have, that means that 88% of New York State residents live in communities that are committed to taking action to mitigate and adapt to climate change, something of which I think we can be very proud. Excuse me. Development of long-term community capacity to address climate change through citizen involvement is an important component of the Climate Smart Community Program. The most basic requirement for Climate Smart Community certification is that the community appoint a Climate Smart Community Task Force and a coordinator. That is the one mandatory requirement. And we put that in place because what we saw through the early stages of the program, that we never had a community that was successfully engaged in the Climate Smart Community Program unless there was a person responsible and a task force that consisted of elected officials, municipal staff, and what I sometimes call agitated agitators, people who were volunteers who were putting pressure on those officials to implement their pledge. The Climate Smart Community Portal, which I'm showing here, climatesmart.ny.gov, provides a one-stop shop for community members to learn about the Climate Smart Community Program and ways their communities can participate. And the portal is where designated community members, usually the coordinator and other task force members or volunteers, go to submit their applications for certification. DEC accepts applications for certification 3 times a year, but the information on the portal is always available. As I described earlier, the certification program is based on a large set of specific actions communities can take to earn points toward certification. And the portal provides detailed information to help plan and implement the actions the community has chosen to take, as well as information on how those communities pursuing certification can earn points by documenting completion of that action. The important point, however, is that this information is useful for and available to any community interested in that action, not just those pursuing Climate Smart Community certification or even just to Climate Smart communities. And I'll mention another thing in that map that I've shown, that Google Maps-based utility, this thing. If you want to see what any one of these certified communities has done, you simply need to hover over, this is just an image, so it's not going to work, but you hover over that pin and you will get a link that will let you see not only the profile of that community, but all of the documentation that community has provided to us, the voluminous documentation we require to document each of the actions that has been completed. So, and you can also filter. So if you want to see all of the, let's say, greenhouse gas inventories that have been produced and submitted to us in application for certification status, there's a screen that will let you filter for all the communities that have completed greenhouse gas inventories, and then go to the individual inventory report for every one of those communities. So there's just a wealth of data here that you can use to help, the community can use to help plan its own actions. So if we look a little bit closer to home, your home, I live in Albany County, Schenectady County, both the county and city of Schenectady were early adopters of the Climate Smart Community Program, both registered in the first year of the program, 2009. The county then became one of the first to become certified in 2017. But frankly, we would have liked to see it progress toward the silver level. I'm not sure that I don't know if there's actually activity at the Schenectady County level to move towards silver, but we certainly would like to see that. And the city of Schenectady, as well as the towns of Glenville and Niskayuna, appear to be stuck at the registered level. Now, I'm not saying this to be critical. Becoming certified is hard. We intend it to be. But if you are sitting there wondering what you can do to help address the climate crisis, the Climate Smart Community Program is an opportunity for you, and that's why I discussed it tonight. Municipal elected officials and staff cannot make a local Climate Smart Community Program work without the active involvement and assistance of residents. And I'll also mention that we have had good experience. We have seen many municipalities use their local college students to support their own Climate Smart Community Program. And there's even some situations where high school students have played an important role. And in fact, have even chaired the Climate Smart Community Task Force. So again, we want to see a community involvement. And community members and leaders may well ask, in fact, I think should ask at this juncture in time, what can our community do and what can I do to help? And I would suggest that now is the perfect time to commit, or if a past commitment has faded, recommit to making your community a fully engaged climate smart community. You would begin by organizing or reorganizing a local task force to develop your climate action plan and to ensure municipal officials implement it. And then you could use the certification framework available at that portal as a guide to take advantage of technical and financial resources to improve energy efficiency and install renewable sources of power to reduce both municipal greenhouse gas emissions and taxpayer costs, and to adopt policies to encourage residents and businesses to do the same. And your plan should also consider how your community will adapt to the changing climatic conditions that are inevitable. And finally, you need to understand that mitigating and adapting to climate change is not a one-off or short-term commitment. The fight will require a long-term commitment, but the Climate Smart Community Program and all the supporting agencies are here to help as much as we possibly can. And I put this in mostly because I'm always asked, what can we do as individuals? If you'd like, you can conduct your own personal or household greenhouse gas inventory. There are a number of online tools to calculate your own personal greenhouse gas footprint. If you've got a high school kid sitting around not doing much, this might be an exercise he or she could do, or even a college student could calculate your household greenhouse gas footprint, then use the results of that inventory to identify the most effective ways for you and your household to reduce your personal impact on the climate. Of course, we need to reduce our waste of both energy and materials as much as possible. You could consider eating a plant-based diet, or at least reducing the amount of meat you consume. The climate will thank you, and your heart probably as well. To the extent feasible, live car-free and minimize air travel. Easier to do than it used to be. More important than any of these, however, is supporting a price on carbon emissions. We need to face it, that having a number of committed volunteers, mostly white affluent volunteers, doing some of these voluntary actions might make us feel good, but they won't mean a lot if the rest of the people on the planet don't do the same. Really, most economists agree that the only way to achieve those universal efforts is to integrate the cost of those of emissions to society into to internalize those, so that those who are emitting those greenhouse gases pay the price. Finally, you can talk about climate change and your concerns, and this is very hard to do. I am personally from a right-wing family in Southwest Pennsylvania, and my father spent 51 years in the coal mining industry. That can make for some very long Thanksgiving dinners when we talk about what I do for a living, but it is important. And in fact, there's literature that suggests that one of the reasons people don't actually take climate change as seriously as they should is that we don't talk about it enough. And finally, and this is particularly timely, I would suggest that anyone who wants your vote should be able to answer the question what he or she will do about climate change, whether that's the president or the highway supervisor, your mayor, what have you. I can't tell you, would not presume to tell you for whom you should vote, but I do think that given the threat posed by climate change to not only to ourselves, but to our children, our grandchildren, and those others around the world, that those people who want to lead us should be able to answer that question. And I'm going to end now in the same way I started, with another timely and timeless quote from Rachel. This one is a reminder that only we humans can save ourselves and future generations from the terrible effects of a warming world, and that each of us has a responsibility to work toward that end. With that, I will close, and in a moment, I'll give you a moment to read that quote to yourself, and then I will put up my contact information as well as the various websites that I've referenced this evening. And I believe now I'm to take questions.
Yeah, we don't have too many, Mark. I have a couple, and what we'll probably end up doing is going ahead and opening it up